Okay.
So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I'm happy to present the Brave database. It's going to be a bit quick, I have to say. I'll focus on the motivation for the database and the methodology. So if any questions, please bring them as well, and we are happy to answer. And then I'll go through the results. So the motivation to begin with was that there's few consolidated efforts to systematically capture corporate harms on people and planet. So whilst there's quite a lot of theoretical advancement, not a lot of capturing the large-scale view, let's say, there are a few databases available on human rights and environmental abuse, but notably none of them were publicly available. So that was a big motivation for this data set in particular. I'm just gonna... So the next slide, please. So then we partnered with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, now the Business and Human Rights Center at the University of Pisa, to track 83 multinational enterprises and their allegations of abuse between the time period of 2000 and 2020. We examined over 27,000 records of allegations of human rights abuse as a team of 5 researchers and over 50 research assistants. So the breakdown of the home jurisdiction of these companies is, as you can see here, so the largest ones were France, Germany, United Kingdom, and some of the large companies were these ones here, as expected, out of the 83 largest in Europe. We broke down the type of abuses into 19 macro categories and 5 macro categories for types of victims. And you can see here to the right is the macro categories of the abuses. Yeah, those ones. We also, as a way to capture the severity of abuse, captured whether it was a violation of physical integrity, such as torture, forced disappearance, death, and violence. So yes and no to this. And whether or not it was a violation of a non-derogable right that can never be infringed under any circumstance. So right to life, freedom from slavery, prohibition of torture. And then as an example of how the information we captured in the database, you can find the company name, the country where the alleged abuse took place, the type of abuses, a brief description of the event, whether or not it was directly or indirectly perpetrated by the company, so the parent and subsidiaries of this company in this case, if it was an infringement of non-derogable right, physical integrity right, and the years that it was started, allegedly ended, and first reported. So out of these 83 companies in the time frame of 2000 and 2020, we found 4,314 human rights and environmental abuses. And 98% of the corporations were involved in at least one abuse between 2000 and 2020. So in the figure to the left, it captures the companies and the abuses with one abuse per year. So as you can see, it increased and then somewhat decreased from 2050. And in the figure to the right, you can see the total number of abuses in the data set overall that then decreased from 2015. Amongst the types of abuses, the most common ones were negative environmental impact and negative health impact. Direct abuses were somewhat more common than indirect abuses. Yeah, and there you see the breakdown of that. And then 83% of the corporations were involved in at least one abuse breaching a non-derogable right. And 98% were involved in at least one abuse of physical integrity. So meaning quite a large percentage were involved in more severe abuses captured in this way. And in both these types of abuses, the majority of cases were targeting workers, followed by communities. Since there's also an EU project, we captured abuses or allegations of abuse happening in the EU 27 zone and outside of the EU 27 zone. So the top line here in the figure is the total number of abuses, followed by the ones happening outside of the EU. And then at the bottom, you see the line for the abuses captured that happened in the EU. This is as well a heat map. The darker the blue color, the more allegations of abuse occurred in the country. So the countries where most abuses occurred were United States, Brazil, followed by Nigeria and Colombia. And it's an open access database followed with a guide for the users. So we do recommend that you have a look at the guide when using the database, and all of this data set can be then openly used by anyone. So yeah, activists, students, researchers alike. So please share it. Here you can find the link to all of the data set. And last but not least, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of the team that were involved.
I will just continue briefly that our another research team, Wageningen University, Nada Bernas, Chiara Maki, and Kasper Zayez, and together with Yaroslav Mudry National Law University, myself, Yuri Barabash, and Tamara Horbachevska, we are working on corporate actors' impact on the rule of law index, and we developed our suggestions how this index could be built, and I will explain briefly in 1 minute. But also we were piloting this index, so we took 4 countries, the Netherlands, Poland, Serbia, and Ukraine, for piloting this index. And why we took these countries? Because the Netherlands is an example of well-established democracy with high ranking in the rule of law index, which developed by World Justice Project, and Poland is which is often considering as a new democracy with experience of, of being in non-democratic political regime, and also Ukraine as a candidate country and Serbia as a candidate country, but also with very different story of candidacy. So we developed 8 dimensions to capture corporate impact on the rule of law, and these 8 dimensions include 22 indicators. I will also discover them, and for piloting this index we conducted 44 expert interviews, but also of course we analyzed different reports, materials, also to make our preliminary conclusions about assessment of different countries and different national jurisdictions related to corporate actors' impact on the rule of law. So, and of course, our main hypothesis that we wanted to test was how corporate power could be measured as a rule of law variable. So traditionally, those indexes which are trying to measure the rule of law or different aspects related to the rule of law, and which are reflected in other indexes on democracy, on freedom of expression, and many others, of course, they usually focus on the state institutions and have a very low focus on private power and private actors' role in their influence on different democratic institutions and democratic processes. So our main intention was actually to try to develop lenses and concrete indicators which would give us a possibility to measure lobbying and the corporate capture of political power, also to reflect different impacts of the corporate actors on access to remedies, and also how corporate actors influence on different regulatory regimes, and what kind of informational power corporate actors have, and how it could be again reflected when we are talking about different democratic processes. And from the theoretical point of view, we also developed the framework which call policymakers and academics and civil society actors to reconsider the general understanding of the rule of law, because again, traditionally the rule of law is developed and is considered as a system of instruments and safeguards to protect democracy, human rights from the arbitrariness of the state. But in modern world, we do understand that the environment is much more complex, and this all connections between different actors and the whole landscape is much more complex, and we need to consider the role not just of the state but also of corporations, and how all this interconnected, and what kind of interactions between public authority, private power, civil space, information, remedies exist. And our 8 dimensions that I previously mentioned, they can be divided into 3 clusters, let's say, political and institutional influence, when we can see corporate capture of political power, when we can raise concerns about integrity and transparency, and also when we can see the impact of corporate actors on regulatory sphere. Then the second one, human rights and society, fundamental rights, stakeholder engagement, order and security. And finally, the third one is accountability and remedy, what kind of obstacles to keep corporate actors accountable, and basically the presentations that Sana did is also about corporate accountability, and what kind of grievance mechanisms exist, and again, what how we can make them more efficient. And then we did this piloting of the index. So as I already mentioned, we had this 44 expert interviews, and we measured the rule of law situation in 4 countries based on these 22 indicators, goes through 8 dimensions. And in very general terms, you can see the results of this piloting. So the Netherlands has the best results based on these 8 indicators, but still we have that the strongest resilience is 10 points, and you can see that in terms of security, fundamental rights, accountability, Netherlands shows strong results, but at the same time remedies are still weak, even despite of the fact that, again, from the state-centric perspective, the Netherlands has very high results in rule of law index, but when we go to corporate oriented measurement, the Netherlands also shows quite relatively weak results. And also you can see results of Poland, Serbia, and Ukraine, and what fields are the most concerning. And the access to remedy actually is universal weakness. All countries showed the very weak results based on this measurement. And our main conclusion is about that corporate power operates through multiple channels, and of course all these channels have impact on the rule of law environment in societies, and of course we need to reflect this impact in our understanding of the rule of law and in our tries to measure this impact of corporate actors on the rule of law.
Today, I will present a paper entitled Rethinking Regulatory Change, Business and Supply Chain Due Diligence in the EU, that is co-authored together with Tim Bartley, who was leading the Stockholm team in the Rebalance project. In this paper, we look at an increasingly important question in transnational business governance and political economy. We try to understand under what conditions businesses support the expansion of regulation rather than trying to weaken or avoid it. And we look at this question in the context of the political processes surrounding the CSDDD. So we can go to the next slide there. Thank you. So let's start with the sort of existing literature and the expectations that we typically have about the business support for the adoption of new legislation. There are mainly two explanations in existing literature. First, there is a big discussion about the leveling of the playing field, where scholars working on regulatory politics and political economy often argue that firms tend to support binding regulations when they are already bound to stricter domestic rules than their competitors. And this is because the adjustment costs tend to be relatively low and that there are competitive advantages of other firms to be bound by the same rules. And there are several examples of this dynamics in the literature, such as Kinderman, who has been studying this in the context of the non-financial reporting directive, Chalmers on banking, and De Sombre and Vogel has looked on this in the context of environmental regulation. Second, there is also a lot of literature about what are the effects of voluntary standards, and here the evidence are more mixed. There are some authors that argue that companies that have already adopted voluntary standards tend to be more supportive of regulatory expansion than firms that have not. But at the same time, there are literature in political economy that is quite critical of these arguments. And these researchers tend to argue that voluntary sustainable commitments are often used instead as a sort of way to avoid binding regulation, and that firms generally prefer flexibility and reputational benefits over strong and enforceable obligations. In this paper, we sort of take as a point of departure these different assumptions and argue that they need to be reconsidered. And we highlight two important shifts that lead us to sort of reconsider these arguments in the existing literature. First, there has been a sort of, and particularly if we look at the EU, when the first sort of years of the negotiations of the EU Green Deal were really in a very sort of enabling political environment. But in the sort of later phase when these policies were negotiated, was a period that was marked by geopolitical conflicts, energy crisis, economic crisis, and competitiveness concerns, where businesses became less interested in sort of exporting domestic constraints and become more interested in sort of renegotiating or weakening or delaying these constraints. And second, we also argue that there is a rise of global value chain regulation that changes the politics of regulation itself, because these regulations have a different nature. They are not only about sort of harmonizing national rules, but more about setting rules about firms' responsibility for risk that goes beyond the boundaries of the firm. And we argue that this is something new and that sort of needs new explanations. So in this paper, we ask, when do businesses support the expansion of binding supply chain regulation? And we show that, as I will explain soon, that this support becomes more likely when these two conditions converge, when firms have already developed their organizational capacity through voluntary standards, and there is also a sort of credible threat of even stricter national regulation. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So the CS3 is a really good case for exploring this question, because it generated a very deep division within the business community. Here is a sort of database that we developed. We coded all the statements that were submitted to the EU under the three consultation phases. It shows really that from the sort of left side, where businesses are completely opposed, to the right side, where they are supportive, that they are fairly equally sort of distributed across these different categories. Some firms describe the directive as extremely burdensome and excessively punitive, while others were publicly defended it and actively lobbied in its favor. Okay, we can take the next slide. So methodologically, we carried out 42 qualitative interviews with business representatives, policymakers and CSOs and industry associations. And we also coded, we did a sort of quantitative database on business positions, where we coded business positions on these policies. And then we carried out sort of sub-case studies, where we looked at 4 particularly theoretically interesting, from the point of view of our hypothesis, cases. We looked at France and Germany, who already have due diligence legislations in place. And then we looked at the Netherlands, who already have sort of advanced proposals. And then we also looked at a transnational coalition of sustainability frontrunners that were often mobilized by civil society actors and collaborated with civil society. Okay, so yes, thank you. I will begin with the French case. The French case is really interesting and important, because they already had the duty of vigilance law that from 2017, so it had already existed for a couple of years. And this was one of the world's first comprehensive due diligence law that covered both environmental and human rights issues. And at the first glance, you would expect that French firms would support the CSDDD in order to extend similar obligations to other companies on the EU market. The CS3 largely sort of build on the French law and have many important similarities. And initially, what we saw that many firms, they cautiously sort of supported an EU level approach. But also the story is much more complicated, because the French business associations, they increasingly started to use the EU process to try to weaken important aspects of their own domestic laws. And the most important conflict concerned the financial sector. French banks started to become concerned that the directive would expose them to legal liability for financing social environmentally harmful activities. And as one interview explained to us, that the French government was during this period, the French government was trying to strengthen Paris as a sort of financial sector after the Brexit. So that rather than trying to sort of generalizing French constraint, the business actors started to push for excluding finance from the CSDDD, and in that way weaken their own law. And this ultimately succeeded, because the financial sector was excluded from the directive. And over time, we also saw that broader opposition was intensified, and MEDEF, the most important business associations in France, described it as openly repressive. And French business sector later even supported efforts to weaken or remove civil liability during the omnibus negotiations. So this is clearly a case where businesses did not try to primarily seek to level the playing field in the EU negotiation. Okay, so moving on to the next case. The German case shows a somewhat similar dynamics. Germany adopted this German Supply Chain Act in 2021, and German business associations were strongly opposed to the CSDDD from the beginning, and their key concern was that the directive went beyond the German law, particularly regarding civil liability, environmental obligations, and broader supply chain coverage. And they pushed intensively against these provisions and supported attempts to create a safe harbor protection for companies participating in these industry schemes. And opposition intensified further once the German law actually entered in force, and companies were complaining about unreasonable bureaucratic burdens and administrative complexity. And rather than treating the CSDDD as a sort of harmonizing solution, many companies started to see it as an opportunity to weaken both the EU directive and the German national law in itself. And as one EU policymaker told us, the real political goal for some of the actors were essentially to get rid of the German one and also to get rid of the national law. So again, here we see this is a case where we see that prior national regulation did not straightforwardly generate support for upward harmonization. So the next slide, I cannot really see your comments in the chat, but maybe Tim can respond to the questions. I see that some questions came up. Okay, so regarding
I'm doing that.
Okay, thanks. So regarding the sustainability frontrunners, in this context of resistance of national business communities and associations, the sort of another coalition became really important, and this was a sort of loosely organized transnational coalition of sustainability frontrunners, and these included large firms like IKEA, L'Oreal, Ferrero, Nestle, Nokia, and others, and these were often mobilized by civil society organizations. And these were firms that had a long experience of developing voluntary due diligence practices through the OECD guidelines or the United Nations guiding principles, through certification schemes or traceability systems. And this really was quite important because many of these systems already had this internal system. So for them, the CSDDD was not seen as so threatening. And they were really important because they helped to shift the narrative around the directive by showing that this was feasible. And they could also be very sort of important in providing technical expertise to policymakers and engaging in a more constructive way. And they also contributed to divide the business community by undermining claims from the peak associations that they represented the sort of whole business community and showing that this was not the case. And one policymaker told us that without the supportive companies, the directive would likely have not survived politically its adoption in 2024. And they also they were also very important in intervening in key moments in their respective member states, like Swedish firms. You had IKEA, Volvo, and H&M that were important in sort of shaping the Swedish government's final position. And in Italy, Ferrero has lobbied the Meloni government in favor of the directive. But of course, this has also its limitations. Okay, I will have to move a little bit more quickly, but they were not necessarily supportive of a sort of very stringent directive, but mostly sort of the procedural obligations. Okay, let's move to the Netherlands. The Netherlands illustrate a somewhat different dynamics where you sort of have a combination of long history of voluntary CSR engagement with credible threat of stricter national legislations. Dutch firms had already extensive experiences of voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives, And at the same time, there were proposals for an ambitious national legislation that in some respects went beyond the CSDD. And in this context, the EU directive was a sort of seen as a sort of acceptable compromise for many companies. And the Dutch financial institutions stand out here. For example, they were much more supportive of inclusion of the financial sector in the directive than French banks and banks in other countries. So here we see the sort of the strongest support for the EU regulation when we have this sort of combination of voluntary experiences with the threat of more stringent domestic rules. Okay, so next slide to wrap up. We have seen that these sort of supply chain regulations have revealed a very deep divide within the business community, and other researchers have also documented this in the context of other regulations. Some see these measures as burdensome, while others see them as a sort of opportunity to spread obligations to laggards and level the playing field. But this sort of divide in the business community is different than what we would expect if we would look at the existing literature. So first, our findings suggest that national regulations are likely to be insufficient to create a sort of support for leveling field when they are not deeply integrated in firms' routines. And in these situations, businesses that are already subject to national constraint may use region negotiations not to export their constraint, but to renegotiate and weaken them. Second, an important finding is that the voluntary sustainability initiatives may generate more support from regulatory expansion than the existing political economy research would usually assume. While we agree that, of course, that voluntarism have many limitations, long-term voluntary engagement with due diligence practices seem to have generated some sort of organizational capacities and some openness to abiding regulation, especially when it builds on and institutionalizes voluntary standards. We think that this is an important question, and there is a need for more research, comparative research on how these dynamics are playing out in the context of geopolitical conflicts, in the context also of different types of regulations, such as the UDR, the CBAM, and with different sectors, such as critical minerals and textiles and so on. Okay, thank you very much.
Now we can go for the next presentation, and we are very glad that today Ariana Rossi joined our webinar, and Ariana represents International Labour Organization, and she will speak about decent work in supply chains and the role of the International Labour Organization. And Ariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me. I actually had just an internet issue just now, so my computer is unable to connect to the internet, so I'm on my phone, but I hope it works. And unfortunately, this means that you will not be able to see my slides, but they were not a beauty anyway, so I will send them to you afterwards as soon as the computer is back. But I thought, well, first of all, I should start by saying thank you so much for the invitation to be in this group today. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to connect with this body of research and debate that is sometimes a little bit outside of the engagement we have at the ILO. So I think it's already, I feel like I've learned a lot. So thank you very much for that. My entry point into this discussion is really an institutional and a policy one. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a background of how the ILO fits into this governance picture when it comes to global regulation of labor standards, especially in a context of global supply chains. So I will start by saying that the ILO is, I think, as I hope most of you know, is the oldest agency in the United Nations system. It's more than 100 years old. We are a tripartite organization, which means that our governance system is not only member states, of which there is 187, but also employer and worker organizations have the same voice in decision making at the ILO. So in that, it is a very unique UN agency and one that is really uniquely positioned to regulate the labor market. And of course, one of the key elements of our work is the negotiation and establishment, ratification, and monitoring of international labor standards. So when it comes to globalization in general and global supply chains more specifically, of course, this was a bit of a watershed moment in terms of the role of the ILO in regulating the labor market, because for the first, let's say, 85 years of its history up until the mid-90s, before globalization really took center stage, the role of international labor standard was very clearly understood to be a globally negotiated set of tools that then are ratified at the national level and are implemented at the national level. And that worked relatively well, let's say, depending, of course, on the capacity at the national level to regulate. But it worked because the extra jurisdictional aspect of global supply chains was not yet into the picture. So it's only in the early 2000s that the ILO, being slightly slow as an organization, because consensus among the three parties in the labor market is, of course, hard to achieve, started to deal with the social dimension of globalization. And this really started with a World Commission on the social dimension of globalization in 2002 that culminated into a report that basically positioned the ILO to have a central role in order to make sure that there is a human-centered approach to globalization, and that the social benefits and the potential for social justice brought about by increased international trade and globalization is taken into account together with all the benefits that were at the time very much evident in terms of economic development. This was re-emphasized in the Social Justice Declaration, which is one of our big tripartite declaration in 2008. And at the same time, in the early 2000s, the ILO started to work operationally on how to ensure compliance with international labor standards in a global supply chain context. And the prime example of that, the more operational example of that, is from 2001. The ILO started a program called Better Factories Cambodia, that then became the Better Work program, which is basically a very workplace level intervention of monitoring compliance with fundamental principles and rights at work and national legislation in garment factories. And that was a way of almost incubating a model of work that tried to demonstrate that having decent work, which is really the core of what the ILO is about, and increasing compliance with national laws and international labor standards does not come at the expense of economic competitiveness and trade competitiveness in a global supply chain context, but rather it can reinforce the competitive advantage of firms in a global market. Of course, I'm simplifying a debate that is very complex, but it's just to give you a little bit of the historical background of how the organization has played a role over time in these debates. From a normative point of view, and it's interesting that in the comments, this question of the UN binding treaty also came up. The ILO, again, of course, is mostly known and appreciated by what we call the constituents, the tripartite constituents, because of this normative function. And it is since the early 2000s that the question of whether or not the international labor standards that the ILO already has are sufficient and are fit for purpose to regulate the globalized economy, and whether new standards need to be in place to address the specific challenges that are brought about by a cross-border nature of production practices. The first official, let's say, moment to discuss this in a tripartite manner the ILO came in 2016 when there was an International Labour Conference general discussion. So this is when all member states of the ILO meet and discuss all together the question around decent work in supply chains at the time. And it was the first time that it was the organization was officially mandated to investigate whether or not these standards are fit for purpose. Of course, as you can imagine, and I think what I'm saying fits very much with what we just heard from the analysis before, there is a lot of heterogeneity in how constituents perceive this question. Traditionally, well, obviously, I should start with the obvious. The worker group at the ILO is very much in favor of having a new standard. They argue that the existing standards are not sufficient to ensure decent work in supply chains, and therefore they argue that there is scope and a mandate for the ILO to issue a new standard. Interestingly, employers, and I think this again really echoed what we just heard, the employer group at the ILO is very much against it and is very much of the opinion that the issues that we find in terms of labor rights violations in supply chains are not the result of global production or responsibilities of business actors, but it is an outcome of poor enforcement of existing standards and poor enforcement of national law in especially in contexts that are have weak governance and weak rule of law and weak capacity. Now, what is interesting is that the employer group at the ILO does not necessarily represent the large multinational enterprises that have operations across borders, who, again, as we've just heard also from the other colleagues, tend to be, in a way, much more progressive when it comes to understanding the benefits of global governance and global regulation. So there is an interesting internal division in this. The other aspect that is, of course, again, self-explanatory is that within what we call the government group that is divided by regions, there's also huge divisions and huge heterogeneity of opinion when it comes to the need of a standard or not, because traditionally countries in the global north tend to advocate for a more regulated labor market to avoid social dumping, basically, and have a level playing field in the global economy, whereas developing countries tend to argue that this is a protectionist measure, basically. So all this started to say the intervening years after 2016 until 2023 were basically a stalemate in which the organization could not find a consensus to move forward to work in earnest on not only on this normative question, but also in practical terms, operationally, on capacity building and technical assistance when it comes to, for example, responsible business conduct or SME development, market access, all the things that are part and parcel of what the ILO does every day on the ground, but there was a political stalemate. So in 2023, we who work on this issue internally at the ILO were very relieved to see that there was finally a bit of a breakthrough, and there was a consensus to work on an ILO strategy on decent work in supply chains, which included a normative question. Now, the normative question at hand is always the same. Would we need a new standard or not? And at the time, in 2023, it seems like there was, at the heels of all the discussions around mandatory human rights due diligence, that there may be more scope and an opening for ILO to take more of a center stage and enter that discussion with the with a normative discussion there. Of course, in the intervening time, we just had actually this question posed at the governing body in March, so just 2 months ago, because the political environment has dramatically shifted. In between, the decision so far has been taken to not develop any new standard and to continue the implementation of all the other means of action of the ILO when it comes to promoting decent work in supply chains. And this include strengthening the use of the ILO instrument on responsible business conduct, which is a companion instrument to the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines. It's the ILO M&E declaration, supporting human rights due diligence processes with data and technical advice, ensuring that we have programs to promote fundamental principles and rights at work in supply chains, and in particular, freedom of association and collective bargaining, developing new research and new knowledge and making this evidence accessible for policymakers, continue develop new technical assistance at the country level, and also importantly, ensuring policy coherence with other multilateral actors and making sure that the policy advice we provide to governments on employment policies and decent work is aligned with advice that is given by, for example, other UN agencies or IFIs on trade and investment policies. So I think it's a very interesting position to be in right now, because in my personal opinion, this development was received, for example, by the worker group as a bit of a letdown. But I do think that there's only one thing that is worse than having no standard, and that's having a weak standard that nobody cares about. So that would be inevitably what would be the case now if there wasn't enough political momentum behind it. So I think, history has shown that this is not a fast organization that responds in a cutting edge moment to the challenges of our time, but is rather a consensus building process that delivers instruments that are there for the long haul. And I think this will not be different when it comes to decent work in supply chains. The non-normative work that we do as an organization, and I worked for many years in the Better Work program, which is what I mentioned before, the really on the grounds in garment factories type of intervention, delivers benefits that are very tangible and are very much in support of delivering a proof of concept of what can be done with non-normative measures and what is still yet to be done. And therefore, I think having more time to demonstrate that there is an actual normative gap may work in the favor of then having a robust and powerful instrument when the time and the political environment is conducive to its development.
Yeah, my presentation will be about the hidden costs of energy transition. We surely need the energy transition. We need to shift from a fossil fuel based economy to a more green and renewable energy based economy. But we need to do that in a just way, in a way that is just for everybody and not only for our European countries. It has to be just for all communities in the world. And the question is, who is right now paying all the costs that the energy transition requires? Yeah, this is a map of all our projects in the world. And I will present the Indonesian case. As we all know, the energy transition requires many minerals and a huge quantity of metals and mineral, the now called critical minerals. And the extraction of these minerals comes with enormous social and environmental costs. Indonesia is the largest producer of nickel in the world. And as you know, the nickel is a major component of batteries, fundamental for electric vehicles and electric equipment. And the island of Sulawesi is the principal hub for the extraction and the processing of nickel. This is Sorowako. This was once a small fishing farming village. But since the late 60s, the PT Vale, the mining company, arrived, and the area has been so transformed that also the name changed from Sorowako to Nickel Village. The nickel is generally extracted in open pit mines, covering huge and vast areas of land, and this results in massive deforestation, biodiversity loss, ecosystem destruction, and land grabbing. Farmers usually lost their land and their livelihoods. There are two principal indigenous communities in the area fighting for their territories and the loss of the rice fields. The smelter, this is a picture from the smelter of Sorowako that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we can see that the sky is actually orange due to the particulate matter in the air and all the pollution produced by the industry. We analyzed the air around the smelter and the mine. The air is polluted. We found levels of particulate matter, VOC, and sulfur dioxide higher than the Indonesian standards for air quality. Next slide. There aren't proper mining tailings or waste facilities, and this results into the pollution of also soil and water. Next. In this site, this is a point in the Matano Lake, that is the biggest lake close to Sorowako. And we measured, exactly in this point, we measured chromium-6 levels. Chromium-6 is a known cancerogen, and we measured the level higher 10 times the Indonesian standard for environmental water quality. That is higher than the European standards. We collected in general different sample of water, and we found very high levels also of nickel and manganese in rivers and lakes. These are, wait, sorry, the previous one. Thank you, Elena. And the waters are the water resources that the communities use for domestic purposes and for their rice fields. This is a picture taken from Morowali. Morowali is in another area of the island of Sulawesi. This is an industrial complex where the nickel is processed. While in Sorowako they extract the nickel, here they process it. Morowali is a cluster of more than 50 companies. It was established in 2013 as a joint venture between Chinese and Indonesian investors, and it has grown a lot. It's one of the largest nickel processing hubs in the world, as we can see in the picture. In the next slide, we see a picture taken from the Morowali area. There are now around 100,000 workers in that area, and all the people are living along a single coastal road without adequate housing. There is no sewage system, there is no garbage collection system, and no hospital. And as you can imagine, in such a big industrial complex, there are quite a few accidents, even fatal. In the next slide, we see a picture of the ocean close to the image. The environmental impact is equally devastating. This is a coastal area that is part of the coral triangle, one of the most biodiverse marine ecosystems on the planet. And the coral reefs are dying due to the turbidity. In the next slide, we can observe the wave. The next slide, thank you. This one, we can observe the wave of sediments discharged by the industries directly into the ocean, producing pollution of the water and coral reef destruction. And all the people depends on the ocean for their livelihood. It used to be a fishing village. The pollution of the air, the previous one, please. The pollution of the air is quite an issue. Because there are more than 15 smelters in IMIP area, and the communities are so close to the industry. This is a school. And we can see all the facilities actually in the backyard of the school. The air is very polluted in Morwali, and we measured concentration of nickel particulates in open air that are higher than the maximum level accepted for indoor quality in Europe, but into industries. So in open air in Morwali is higher than indoor in industry, indoor air for European. The next one, to power all of this, the IMIP burns coal. There are approximately 5.5 gigawatts of coal-powered electricity captive plant. That is the equivalent to the entire electricity production of Portugal. And the coal is being burned for making the nickel, but not only the nickel, a series of metals that are used also for wind turbines and all the nickel metal that is used for the production of electric vehicles battery, for example. In the next slide, we see some of the owners of refineries, because I presented the IMIC complex and the Sorowako mine, but there are much more. Cattle is one of the principal industry Chinese company buying the nickel metal produced in IMIP, and cattle produces batteries that are used in industries such as Tesla or Volkswagen. So we have our clean cities with our green vehicles, but in Indonesia happens all of this. In the next slide, the good news, because we have been to, we are using this data for doing some advocacy and lobbying activities. We sent our scientific report with all these results to the IRMA, because the IRMA audit the PT Vale in Sorowako, because they asked for being accepted as a responsible mining. So we sent our report to the IRMA, and we hope they are reviewing it. We also have been to Brussels. Here there is a terrible photo with us, with the European members of the parliament, alongside with our Indonesian partner, Wali. And we presented our findings, and we called for stronger supply chain due diligence. We also connected Wali with the Ericsson company that was interested in the Indonesian situation. And we went to Stockholm, where we met one of the 7 Swedish pension funds that holds as investments in PT Vale. We presented the situation and urged them to demand higher environmental and human rights standards for the company. And the fund is now meeting with Vale's CEO in the next weeks.
We have 5 presentations and only 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I've asked the presenters to try to be as brief as possible, which will give us time, hopefully, for just a quick question or two immediately after each presentation. and then more time for discussion at the end. We'll start with Rachele Cavara, who's presenting the work that she and Francesco Zerpoli, who unfortunately can't be with us today, did on business influence on EU regulatory processes. Then we'll move to Tommaso Pardi from ENS Paris Saclay on EU incomplete governance and the dysfunctional role of lobbying. And then Philip Schleifer from the University of Amsterdam on the EU deforestation regulation in times of backlash. Stefan Renkens from the University of Toronto on private assurance and EU regulation. And finally, Luc Franzen from the University of Amsterdam on citizen perspectives on EU environmental regulations. So I will turn it over to Rachele, and you're welcome to share your own screen as Rachele has already done.
Yeah, do you see everything? All right, thank you, Barclay. So yes, let's start this session by discussing business influence on EU regulatory processes. So this topic has a long history of research in both organization studies and political science. But let's say that recent events in the EU underscore the importance of revisiting how we understand how business influence current regulatory processes in the European Union. So indeed, there seems to be an issue in how the EU addresses regulation on wicked problems. So, well, very briefly, wicked problems such as climate change, poor air quality in our cities, or carbon-based energy production are normally addressed via multiple and parallel, oftentimes, regulatory initiatives, each one tackling some aspects of some modules of complex wicked problems, be they environmental or industrial or social and health dimensions, for example. So wicked problems normally present a rise in regulatory complexity and dynamism in the EU that seem to put into stress the democratic governance in EU lawmaking. And this happens when the outcomes in terms of, well, regulations, adopted regulations of regulatory initiatives seem to suffer from the pressure of private and business interest groups that manage to influence them in a way that benefits their private interests with respect to public interests. So there seems to be a need to ask ourselves again, how do business stakeholders still manage today to capture or to weaken, to water down EU regulation in a regulatory context of strong democratic governance of lawmaking? But also this leads to ask, how come that the governance of EU lawmaking does not prevent capture for salient sustainable regulation in the EU? So we addressed these sort of questions from an organizational perspective because the team that addressed the questions was composed by organizational scholars rather than political scientists. So this meant that we selected a case study that we considered exemplary to tackle the research questions. We studied it in depth and at micro level, analyzing the dynamics and the mechanisms of how business actors or business stakeholders influenced the regulatory file that we selected as a case study. Meaning that we looked at how policymakers and which policymakers and stakeholders were involved in discussing the regulatory file, their different political preferences, and how they implemented strategy to support their political preferences and see them represented in final legislative outcomes. So the case study we selected is the Euro 7 regulation. I guess we are all quite familiar here with what the Euro 7 regulation is. It was quite central to the political agenda of the first von der Leyen Commission. It was explicitly mentioned in the aftermath of the Dieselgate scandal as a needed regulation to better control emissions and pollution from road transport in the EU. And it was also mentioned in the Green Deal of 2019. So despite being quite salient and quite supported by the political context between 2019 and 2024, after 5 years of discussion and negotiations, Euro 7 presented tailpipe emissions from passenger cars, that is its core, untouched from Euro 6. And this sparked much political and public debate in Brussels and across the EU. So we analyzed the case in depth through qualitative methodology and also social network analysis. And what the results that emerged is that two well-defined polarizing coalition discussed a central topic in Euro 7 of conflict, a topic of conflict. That was the reduction of tailpipe emissions. So they tried to influence Euro 7 through regulation-specific topics, which is not great news in the studies of business influence on the EU. So, for example, the supporters of Euro 7 stated that it was necessary to protect human health, and it was also feasible in terms of the development of emissions reduction technologies and their availability in the market. On the other hand, opponents of stricter emissions, mirrored the same arguments, but in an opposite direction. So they kept pushing that Euro 7 was not the best option to tackle morbidity outcomes for human health from air pollution in the EU, and that the technologies in terms of pollution traps or selective catalytic reductions were not actually ready to be integrated in vehicle architectures. But what emerged actually from the study is that opponents, the coalition resisting stricter emission standards, used 2 additional strategies to be able to weaken Euro 7 emissions. The first one was relating Euro 7 to other regulatory initiatives in the EU regulatory ecosystem around the issue of reducing emissions from road transport. So, for example, according to opponents of Euro 7 was interdependent on the outcome of the discussions that were going on at the same time on the CO2 regulations, but also of other packages, such as the roadworthiness package. The second strategy was that they kept relating the outcome of Euro 7 negotiations to the rules and structures of lawmaking in the EU according to best practices of the better regulation. So they kept saying since the very beginning that they doubted actually that Euro 7 respected the principle, for example, of proportionality of EU regulation, especially in terms of the calculation of its cost effectiveness. And they went very much into the detail of the methodologies used by the European Commission to calculate the cost and benefits of Euro 7 in the phase of its preparation. So, but what happens? So it seems that in the case of Euro 7, there was influence to weaken tailpipe emissions was a combination of active influence tactics from opponents, but that relied also on a horizontal and vertical conceptualization of the broader lawmaking and regulatory environment as they are. So they relied on elements of governance that exceeded their control, actually. So linking Euro 7, for example, to the outcome of CO2 regulation negotiations was just a speculation before the CO2 regulation was actually adopted. Okay. Likewise, stating that Euro 7 didn't show benefits related to their cost and thus conflicted with the rules of the better regulation was a way to seek sort of procedural legitimacy of their claims of wanting to weaken Euro 7. But what happened that when the CO2 regulation was materialized, was actually adopted, what was simple speculation at the beginning, when preparing Euro 7, became a very concrete anchor that opponents of Euro 7 used to weaken its provisions. And in the same way, seeking procedural legitimacy transformed into a sort of direct obtaining the same procedural legitimacy that they were seeking before. So what could be the policy implications of this work, very briefly? Acknowledging that governing wicked problems via multiple interdependent regulatory initiatives that artificially modularize complex problems may open windows of opportunity for business stakeholders to influence and to weaken regulation. How? Through spillover effects between interdependent files and through a sort of appeal to meta-influence that evaluate the legitimacy of political preferences to be inserted, to be represented according to rules of procedures in legislative outcomes, rather than the influence via the substance of claims and political preferences themselves. So governing lawmaking on wicked problems may require to adapt to wicked problems in order to avoid a sort of democratic paradox, for which when we experience a rise in regulatory complexity, we see that this leads to regulatory vulnerability, which is very counterintuitive. And in order to avoid that the rules and the governance of lawmaking the structures that have been developed in time to ensure democratic representation at the level of the EU lead to non-democratic outcomes. So if we are now in a phase in which there's much discussion about updating or revisiting, rewriting the better regulation package, and maybe one direct policy suggestion that has emerged from our research is that a way to rebalance the relationship between stakeholder influence on regulatory files and the political powers to bring them forward in a coherent way to their initial ambition is to abandon a sort of silos mentality that modularizes wicked problems into multiple different perspectival regulations, while instead there is the need to integrate the work, the organization of work on interdependent files. For instance, very concrete suggestions could be to unify impact assessments, for example. If, we cannot go back in time, but some people say that some informants actually advanced that if the impact assessment for Euro 7 was developed in combination as a one unique impact assessment with the CO2 regulations, maybe this would have offset spillover effects between the two regulatory files and all the work for the automotive omnibus package that we see today. And this implies to unify internal work in terms of the creation of interfunctional and inter-DGs teams in the Commission that foresee the development of interrelated regulations and regulatory files, and unify, of course, also public consultations of citizens. That is all, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this timely workshop. So I will be speaking about the EU deforestation regulation in times of backlash, which is ongoing collaborative work together with Katharina Weber, who's a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. So let me start by just saying a few brief words about the EU deforestation regulation. I think most people probably will be broadly familiar with this policy, but just to make sure that everyone knows what I'm talking about. So it's a mandatory supply chain due diligence law, which is part of the broader EU Green Deal policy package, and they're part of the corporate accountability agenda. And the objective of the policy is to eliminate deforestation from select commodity chains of the European Union. And the policy was first proposed by the Commission in November 2021, and then it was originally scheduled to come into effect at the end of 2024. And just now, these past few weeks, the EUDR again made headlines when the Commission published the results of its April 2026 review of the policy. And one item in particular raised a lot of attention, which was the Commission's proposal to actually remove leather products from the EUDR after a sustained lobbying campaign. So it's a proposal at this stage, but it's also quite likely that it will ultimately happen. And this effectively constitutes a reduction in the product scope of the EUDR, and it comes on top of a number of previous delays and also simplifications of the policy. And I want to give you a more precise overview of the type of backsliding that has occurred in the case of the EUDR. So we distinguish three types of backsliding. So one is timeline slippage, referring to delays in the implementation date. Then there's scope narrowing, which can relate to different things. So it can be product scope, it can be the sectoral scope, it can be the supply chain scope, but also can relate to the size of companies that are covered by a law. And lastly, there's also a stringency weakening, which then refers to reporting, monitoring, and also enforcement provisions. And here on the slide on the timeline, you can see the different backsliding episodes that have happened in the case of the EUDR. So there was a first episode that occurred in the run-up to that original implementation date, where a decision was made to postpone the implementation of the policy for 1 year. Then a second backsliding moment occurred in the run-up to that new date. And again, here a decision was made to delay for another year, and a number of simplifications were introduced, in particular taking the form of lighter reporting duties for downstream companies and small and medium-sized enterprises. And then this latest backsliding episode that happened just now around the dropping of leather from the scope of the EUDR. So it is evident from this that backsliding has happened in this case, but then of course the question also is how significant is this? And here our assessment is that the EUDR actually constitutes a case of relative resilience or bounded backsliding, and then that it has actually been weakened less than some of the other supply chain laws that are also part of this broader EU Green Deal policy package. Maria Teresa had already talked quite a bit about the CSDDD. So here we saw actually quite some major reversals, timeline slippage, major scope reductions, but also stringency weakenings. CSRD, to a somewhat lesser degree, has also experienced significant reversals. And in comparison to that, the EUDR has held up relatively well, with the caveat, of course, that all of these policies remain moving targets and could be subject to further backsliding moving forward. So what interests us in this project is to study the politics of these backsliding episodes, with a particular focus on business actors and business lobbies. And we have coined the term here of organized backlash coalitions, and that is the empirical focus of this project, that we define as private interest groups that mobilize against an adopted or emerging policy by seeking to delay, narrow, or weaken its timing, scope, or stringency, and then drawing on the broader literature on EU lobbying and interest group politics, but also the literature on transnational carbon coalitions. We develop a framework along which we then analyze the activities of these backsliding or backlash coalitions in these different backsliding episodes. So we look at their composition, the positions they take, the frames they use, but also the institutional access they command, as well as the countervailing coalitions that they are confronted with. And applying this framework then to a given backsliding episodes makes it possible to analyze its politics in a more structured way. And one good example here is this leather carve-out that I mentioned initially. So here we actually see, in terms of composition, a highly organized, geographically concentrated, and politically very well-connected business coalition that was particularly centered on the Italian leather sector, which accounts for some 60% of European leather production. So that coalition did not challenge the EUDR's overall objective or its overall architecture, but advanced very specific demands as to the removal of leather from the EUDR, using frames around that leather is a byproduct and that ultimately it constitutes a negligible deforestation risk, and also that that including it in the EUDR would ultimately constitute a disproportionate regulatory burden for European tanneries. And that coalition also had privileged access to key decision-making forums, so it had direct support from an Italian member of the European Parliament, and there are also multiple meetings on record where this coalition was able to directly speak to address members or representatives of the European Commission. And while there was also, in the case of the EUDR generally, but also in this final episode, a very strong counter coalition attempting to block any reversals of the original policy design of the EUDR, arguably that coalition had to defend the policy on multiple fronts and ultimately was less focused and less concentrated when it came to this rather more minor issue of leather. So the result in this episode is bounded backsliding, which, however, largely left the regulatory framework of the EUDR intact. So let me conclude by formulating a few takeaways preliminary, because this is very much work in progress. So as I said, I think what makes the EUDR really interesting for broader discussions about backlash and backsliding of environmental policy in the EU, and in particular supply chain legislation, is that in this case backsliding has been bounded and that it's relatively resilient. It has been weakened, but less deeply than CSDDD and CSRD. And what starts to emerge from our empirical analysis is that the fragmentation of backlash coalitions here played was a contributing factor, played a role. So we see that business mobilization against the EUDR splintered into sector-specific campaigns. So there was a grouping, as described in that episode, around removing leather products. There was a grouping that wanted to remove rubber products. There was a paper coalition. There were also downstream actors. And they lobbied for their specific sectoral interests, but they did not really form a more unified or broader coalition that tried to dismantle the EUDR more fundamentally. So what we see here is that in some cases, these specialized backlash coalitions were able to win targeted concession, but ultimately it seems that their fragmentation may have helped to keep backsliding bounded in the case of the EUDR. And yeah, I will stop here and looking forward to the other presentations and the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for inviting me to the workshop for me to provide some comments on my research, which is research I've been doing with Graham Ault. I'm not presenting a specific paper today, but will rather provide some general comments about our research. And I'd like to focus attention on a sector, a set of actors that is not directly the target of regulation usually, that works more in the background of policy, but is nevertheless a key player in several of the regulations and EU policies that are discussed today, and that is the private or third-party assurance industry, sometimes referred to as third-party auditing or third-party verification services. And EU policies regularly rely on third-party assurance services to assist in assuring compliance with EU rules. There are many examples that are quite recent. In the EU AI Act, for example, there's the obligation for providers of high-risk AI systems to undergo a third-party verification prior to placing the system on the market. In the conflict minerals regulation from 2017, there's a requirement to use third-party audits as part of the due diligence procedures. The deforestation regulation was just mentioned, where the third-party verification is, it's not mandated, but it's allowed to be used to provide information about compliance with the due diligence requirements. It's part of the batteries regulation, corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and also in some older environmental or sustainability-oriented policies such as the emissions trading system, the green bonds regulation, organic agriculture, biofuels, many policies where there is an option or a requirement to use these third-party assurance services. This is not new, however. There's a long history to this use of third-party verification in product harmonization processes and technical standards in the context of the EU single market. But now we see that it's also used quite a lot in environmentally and sustainability policies to assess production processes and practices, including in global supply chains. So this extensive reliance on third-party verification means that through all these policies, this sector of assurance services is continuously being fostered. This raises a lot of questions. A main one is, why is there such a significant and enduring reliance on third-party assurances? And part of the answer lies in the expectations of efficiency gains of, the privatization or outsourcing of part of the compliance verification process to private actors, is that it is expected at least to result in a reduction of policy costs, since the regulator or the bureaucracy does not need to invest in certain expertise or capacity, which of course is linked to the dominance of new public management ideas over the past several decades. Another part of the explanation is that in some issue areas are sovereignty or jurisdictional reasons, with respect to sustainability issues in the context of due diligence type legislations, of course, where you need to verify compliance in global supply chains and other jurisdictions. There's a key reason or a clear incentive to use these assurance services, since you cannot just go verify compliance using regular bureaucratic procedures, and you have to rely to a degree on these third parties assisting with compliance verification. But in our research, we think that's part of the demand side of the explanation in terms of why there is a demand for the use of these services from the side of policymakers. But there's also a supply side to this story. We think, namely, that over time, an entire infrastructure for these services has been built in several issue areas, which policymakers can now rely on. And this becomes clear when we look at the type of actors that are involved in providing these sustainability assurance services. So on the one hand, you have firms that come from the technical inspection and certification sector. As I mentioned, they have long been involved in product testing and certification, and over time, they've added sustainability audits to their services. But these are large multinational corporations, multiple of which were established in the 19th century. And we're talking about Bureau Veritas, SGS, DNV, all the TÜVs, TÜV Süd, TÜV North, TÜV Rheinland, large multinationals that come from that testing, inspection, and certification sector. Another set of actors is composed of the financial accounting firms. So those are the big four, Deloitte, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Ernst & Young. Also large multinational corporations with long histories that play a key role in financial auditing, oftentimes because there's a mandate for companies to have their accounts audited. And these firms over time have also moved in this space of sustainability auditing. And finally, there is a large role for firms that have been established from the 1990s onwards. But that the incentive there or the origins there lie in the larger role that voluntary standard setting schemes have played, industry and multi-stakeholder voluntary schemes. Since a key feature of some of the most legitimate or credible industry or multi-stakeholder schemes is that they use third-party auditing as part of their compliance verification mechanism as well. And so in the past, over multiple decades, this assurance sector has been able to develop and grow in multiple areas before moving into this sustainability space. And they have now acquired a key role in many policy issue areas such that policymakers rely and to a degree trust them. But there, of course, is a lot of criticism to the use of third-party verification or auditing. There are the obvious problems with conflicts of interest and independence when the organization that is being audited also pays for the audits. Similar problems we've seen in other sectors, most notably the credit rating agencies in the context of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. There are problems with effectiveness in that verification and auditing procedures are oftentimes considered to be box-ticking exercises that don't really address the underlying sustainability problems that they're supposed to monitor. And there are problems with exactly the fact that these third-party assurance firms take away capacity and expertise that normally would be built in the state, in the government. Again, similar to potentially what we see with consultancy firms being used in policy formulation work, where also the fact that governments rely on those consultancy firms takes away expertise and capacity in the bureaucracy. You can move to the next slide, Tim. Policymakers, no, sorry, the previous one. Policymakers are well aware of these problems with third-party assurances. They know that there have been many incidents with this type of service provision in the past. One of the most known ones, of course, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, where an audit firm had just performed an audit, given the okay to the facilities there, and then the building collapses. Nonetheless, there exists a level of trust or confidence among policymakers that these services have a place in public policy. And maybe that is because they still view it more as a technical process rather than a process that has multiple political economic dimensions as well. There are certain path-dependent dynamics at work. The more these services are being used in policy, the more expertise these firms build, the more reliant policymakers are on them. And that, of course, increases both the political and the economic power of those firms. In addition, I think the increasing use in many policy areas, not just in the EU, but also in many countries around the world, means that the supply of these services need to keep up with the demand for those services. And that's an issue that policymakers actually not often address or don't think about. Just one example, if we rely on third-party assurances in non-EU countries, for example, in global south countries for supply chain verification, we have to think about, is there sufficient supply of local firms available to do those, to perform those audits? Are there sufficient professionals to supply those services? And that is an important question because research shows that these markets tend toward oligopolistic markets with only a few suppliers, similar to the markets in financial accounting or the credit rating agency market, which of course creates its own set of problems in terms of market dynamics, as well as regulation that might need to be established to address such market imbalances. And oftentimes we see that is absent, lacking. And in our interviews, we also find that policymakers often don't think about that aspect of the assurance service provision. I finally want to link it as well to the lobbying theme of this panel. It's not that we see these assurance services firms themselves actively lobbying policymakers, at least not as much as we originally anticipated. What we see is that, I think Philip just mentioned that as well, that companies that use those services are actually the ones that often advocate for the possibility to use third-party verification, or by extension, the voluntary schemes, to include that as an option in policy. And at the same time, there seems to be somewhat of a backlash as well, as some early advocates of these services, including some environmental NGOs that originally favored these services, they've now turned to being more vocal critics who do not want to see those services being used in EU policy. And again, I think Phillips and Luke's research on the EUDR, for example, shows this, but you see this in other sectors as well. So just to conclude, the assurance industry is a sector that is actively being nurtured by EU policy, is given a quite central role in some of these policy areas. They operate in the background, so they don't attract a lot of attention in the broader policy debate. But I think we should nonetheless ask ourselves whether this is actually a proper way of designing regulatory compliance verification, and what the larger, longer-term implications are of the choice to embed this sector so firmly in the policy design, in terms of the political economic power that we give these firms, as well as the impact on the policy capacity of regulators and bureaucracies. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
This is a presentation with a set of reflections of a public opinion perspective on thinking about environmental and human rights due diligence as shaped by the European Union. It's based on work that is original in part, and it's part based on work by others. So I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Max Joosten through a picture in a moment. Here he is. He's the brains of the operation with regard to the original empirical material I'm presenting, but I'm also liberally citing work by other authors as I find it relevant to sort of develop some food for thought on what is a public opinion perspective on due diligence for the environment and for human rights. So what you may hypothesize if you listen to policymakers nowadays inside the Brussels bubble or near it when it comes to environmental due diligence and environmental regulations at large, is that European citizens and businesses don't want this much EU regulation for business, or they don't want it anymore. And they worry about competitiveness concerns. You might hypothesize that. And then you might hypothesize that the Draghi report, the infamous Draghi report, reflects this and presents a vision for the EU on how to move forward. And then you might hypothesize that the omnibus revisions create a more rudimentary skeletal version of environmental and human rights due diligence. And these revisions then probably have broad support. And in the words of Monty Python's movie on the Holy Grail, there is much rejoicing. But my point is, if you take a deeper look or a better look at public opinion that is available, then you would be led to make slightly different hypotheses about sort of the state we're in with regard to the omnibus moment in thinking about the EU Green Deal, and in particular with regard to environmental and human rights due diligence. And then what I think works better as a hypothesis based on public opinion data is that business survey data that are used to support claims about business concerns about regulation actually do not reveal that the EU regulatory burden is an urgent issue for the investment climate. And that more stringent human rights and environmental due diligence still has broad citizen support. And that indeed the Draghi report informs a political emphasis on competitiveness concerns, and that there is a business lobby that seeks to push that competitiveness discourse forward. Which leads to a moment where a consistent emphasis on such competitiveness and the investment climate could reduce public support for environmental and human rights regulations in the future. And that is sort of the dynamic for which I want to provide a couple of ideas. Some of them I'm liberally stealing from colleagues, and some of them I'm providing through the empirical work that Max and I have done here at the University of Amsterdam. So let's begin let me begin with a Draghi report claim that basically says that regulation is seen by more than 60% of EU companies as an obstacle to investment, with 55% of SMEs flagging regulatory obstacles and the administrative burden as their greatest challenge. Well, my dear colleague, Professor Jonathan Zeitlin, has been in touch with the investigative journal medium Follow the Money to sort of debunk that claim. And what Jonathan and his colleagues point out is the following: that survey results from the European Union actually show that regulation is often a secondary or a moderate obstacle for firms, with other factors ranking higher as constraints on investments. 25% of respondents labeled regulation as a major obstacle, with the rest indicating it was a lesser concern. And a key statistic about small and medium enterprises, namely that 55% see regulation or an administrative burden as their greatest challenge, does not have a basis in the cited survey data in the Draghi report. And data patterns actually imply across nations that national regulations other than those designed by the EU are on SME managers' mind when they respond about regulatory burdens, which throws into doubt all kinds of questions about what the problem with an EU regulatory burden is. So these are insights I want to share that I borrow from Jonathan and from the journalists of the medium Follow the Money. Now, this is the source that you can check if you want to follow up this question itself. So this is about a business attitude to regulation, and you might see parts of a match here with previous presentations here that looked at business attitudes and business lobbies that were varied across different business categories in regulatory processes that US authors analyzed. Now, when it comes to citizen support, I can obviously give first a tip of the hat to Tim with his wonderful work with Matthew Amengual. But for now, I want to focus mostly on the work that Thomas Bernauer and Dennis Kokava and many co-authors have done, because very often they had European firms in focus. And what they find in their research is that across the OECD, but also in Brazil and India, you have broad citizen support for mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence focused on supply chains. And in a lot of the surveys, they find that there's a preference for more stringent regulation with credible enforcement mechanisms, and that a lot of that support comes across the political aisle. Now, these are sources that you can refer to. If you want the slide deck, I can obviously share it with you afterwards. So there's a lot of Kokava and Bernauer and Kokava, but a lot of very smart co-authors who basically established this in their work. Now, Max Joosten from Leiden University and myself, we sort of follow up in this stream, and we plant our flag a little bit later in the cycle in spring 2025, and we ask in a sample taken from Dutch and German citizens and organized by the Ipsos and I&O panel what the attitudes are towards environmental and human rights due diligence regulations of a mandatory type. And then we also find in these surveys that there's still broad support for regulation, and that there's generally a preference for more stringent types of supply chains regulations than the kind that was agreed on in 2024, i.e. the one before the omnibus revision, which further watered down regulation. And that these attitudes generally seem to swing free from political party preferences. And it's important here to mind the timing of the survey, because in 2025, we're already well in a conversation about Trump tariff measures and the economic fallout of that. The Draghi report is already out. There's all kinds of conversations in the Netherlands and Germany about the Europe's economy, the defense strategy that requires more investment, and all kinds of more Dutch and German specific debates about the investment climate. And still, public opinion data basically indicates this kind of a preference. Now, the next thing that Max and I did in our own original research is that we, through a so-called survey experiment, threw a couple of lobby frames at the respondents to check what it would do to their particular preference for supply chain regulation. And here the interesting things was that indeed the preference of citizens turned out to be a little malleable to the sort of signals that we gave them. So if we gave them info about cost increases of products, or the threat that multinationals might move their headquarters as a result of regulation, or that they might withdraw from particular sourcing economies, and presented that as business lobbies, then indeed certain citizens were responsive to those kinds of messages and became less enthusiastic about supporting stringent supply chain regulation. Conversely, if we threw civil society frames at them, where we talked, for instance, about unfair competition among firms between those who are doing a lot on human rights and those who are doing little, or where we talked about consumers having to worry about the fairness of the trade of their products, we also saw that that basically enhanced the enthusiasm of citizens for a particular regulation. So public opinion is not a static thing, and it's possible that it is moved and shaped by this kind of signals that lobbying groups bring. While they might be involved in all kinds of quiet politics that shape the EU policy in the background, they're also doing a form of loud politics that could transform attitudes of citizens over time. So here is a source of a short policy brief that we've made that is based on these findings and that we're currently trying to turn into academic articles in journals. My final thoughts for this forum, and I forgot to thank you all for inviting me to be part of this very interesting conversation, so I'm doing it now, is that I think that support for omnibus revisions to environmental and human rights regulation from a public opinion perspective is questionable, looking at things that I've been able to see in the public opinion world. And I want to basically ask the question, what if business lobby and political emphasis on the state of the European economy and on competitiveness creates rather than reflects concerns among business and citizens about environmental and human rights regulation? Because our data seems to suggest that that is the case. And for me, the bigger message then that is that in the EU policy process, it's very important to keep looking at the role of an independent media, independent academia, and independent civil society, which is able to debunk claims about what surveys say, which is able to voice what could be citizen preferences, real citizen preferences for these kinds of regulation, and which is able to report and critically ask questions. And the final thing I want to do with the final 10 seconds that I have is a short blurb for an article in Global Policy for those of you who want to do social network analysis on global supply chains. I know that Johanna is in the room. I know that Tim is in the room. This is a silly sort of final part to this conversation. I will stop here.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you for organizing this great project and this workshop. I have a little talk prepared called Corporate Political Engagement to Protect Democracy, or better, liberal democracy, if, when, and how. This is a joint project that's a bigger project that I have together with Benedikt Kapteiner, who is a postdoc with me at the Technical University at Dresden, and my good friend and co-author and partner in crime, Craig Smith from INSEAD. We also built a little bit on a workshop we've organized in December 24 at INSEAD, where we asked when should business speak out on political and social issues. So what do I have here? I have 3 questions to answer. Let me focus on the last 2, but and that would be the when and the how. But the if, of course, is important as well. But I think you have discussed that somewhat at length already. But here's my little take: if companies should engage with politics, if they should try to help protect liberal democracy. So there are 2 instruments to make from my perspective, and I developed them in a recent book I wrote in German. I was a little bit adventurous and wrote a book that is not only directed to academia, but to business professionals. It got published in late 25, and it quite found some momentum in the business, in the German business community. So I examined the question I asked here: if so, whether and how companies and their leaders should engage protecting liberal democracy. So as we all know, in a functional differentiated society, I guess in an ideal Friedmanian world, there is the state and the government, and that help establishing a stable legal and economic framework, including sanction. Then there's the company, and the only job of the company would be comply with these hard laws, pay taxes, create jobs, foster innovation. That's the perfect Friedmanian world. And then, Friedman, as we all know, provides these arguments, say, well, you should not engage with politics or with any social issues for that matter, because, business leaders, you spend someone else's money, namely the shareholders' money. If you do that, then you would have less money to invest into whatever R&D, marketing. That would create competitive disadvantages. Yes, there might be a business case for it, but independent of that, then business leaders, you have a competence problem, and there's a fairness and legitimacy problem. So business leaders in general lack the legitimacy to engage with politics or, to engage, to foster any social issues for that matter. Okay. The question I ask in my book and in some other articles is, does that still hold true in the time of monsters, as Antonio Gramsci, our famous Italian communist, would put it? So if we are in the world where people like them, you can call them monsters or not, some people would call them monsters, would take over power, is it enough for business leaders to maintain their neutrality, if there's such a thing in general? So what I do in my book and another project, I ask not necessarily what fascists would do. I think fascists or right-wing or left-wing extremists, they want a revolution. They want another society. But populists, they play the democracy game, and they engage in democratic elections, like this gentleman here, Donald Trump. And what do they do? And I did a little bit of empirical research, but I've also looked into what smarter people than I am wrote before me, and I have my little definition of populists here. So populists, in my opinion, in order to be a populist, you have to make two claims. First is you are the voice of the people. You represent the people. You are the voice of the ordinary people out there. That is the claim of almost all populists that are out there. And then you make the second claim, and that is equally important. You say, well, you are surrounded by enemies, by this corrupt elites these people are talking about. And then they play the democracy name, namely they partake in elections like Donald Trump did. And then, by surprise, not all people will give you your votes, or their votes better. And then you end up with 50% of the vote, and then you're in office. But still, if you claim that you are the only legitimate representative of the people, if you're the voice of the people, and if you claim that you're surrounded by corrupt elites, and then if you're elected with just 50%, that means logically that 50% of the people are your enemies, because they don't get here and they might be part of this, this dangerous elite. And what you need then are domination or power techniques, as I call them. And I looked into, the United States, I looked into Hungary, I looked into Poland for that matter. And the tactics these people employ are always the same. And I call them the 5 techniques of dominations, used by populists everywhere, no matter if they are left-wing populists or right-wing populists. They just use them, and that is the restriction of media freedom, the capture of the state, the weakening of the rule of law, clientelism, patronage, cronyism, and then, of course, the suppression of civil society and discrediting the opposition as not as legitimate as opponents, but as enemies. And if you have that, then, these people become, if they want it or not, a danger for the liberal democracy, for an open society, as Karl Popper would call it. And that is dangerous for companies for many different instrumental reasons. And then I think the main reason here, and I have to be short because I want to spend my time for something else. The main problem for companies is that if these populists undermine liberal democracy with their domination tactics, they create not only risk, but almost an ability for corporate leaders to plan, and that is really dangerous for companies. I think that is the biggest threat for companies. So they should have, and that is what business leaders tell me, they should have an interest to protect liberal democracy. And then there are many normative arguments. Andrea Scherer, Guido Palazzo, of course, Andy, you and Dirk Martin, you've provided many normative arguments. I basically made the same arguments here. I built a little bit more on these three arguments here. I say, well, there's reciprocity. Companies benefit enormously from the institution of liberal democracy. Thus, as corporate citoyens, as liberal corporate citizens, they have a responsibility to protect liberal democracy. There's embeddedness, something normative follows from that. And then, of course, there's the complicity argument. If companies in general or their leaders have the ability, the power to protect liberal democracy, but do not use their resources to do so, they might become silently complicit. But again, that's a normative perspective, and I think you have discussed that at length. What is important for us, and I've developed this in this book, and again, the interesting thing that came out of this book is that I have many conversations with top leading business executives in Germany, and they ask, well, when do we need to engage? And I think this question is important. And we have in an article that is currently under review, but I shouldn't tell you where it is, we try to make a case that companies should not always engage with politics. So we have, well, again, I'm a management scholar, so I have a 2x2 metrics. We think, well, here in this zone, there is a duty to act. When there's a high perceived threat to democracy and when there's high corporate influence, then this is the time for corporate leaders to engage. While here in the restraint zone, when there's people discuss all things in democracies, but then, well, maybe companies should stay neutral in order to prevent further polarization. If they have no corporate influence, then even more so. So we have that. What follows from that is a list of questions I have developed in conversations with business leaders. And here are a number of these questions. I'm happy to share these slides for you in order to try to understand where you are in this zone. You can ask a couple of questions: severity and scope, escalation and urgency, proximity and exposure, social consensus. These are questions under these headlines company leaders can ask in order to understand where they are on this metrics, and then they have a better idea when to engage and when better not to engage. Now, the question how, I think, is equally important. And again, here, another 2x2 metrics. We have found empirically in Germany that there are many different ways company leaders can engage in order to protect liberal democracy. There can be individual engagement. We know that these are CEOs writing letters, using their social media channels, and so on and so forth. But there's also some collective indirect engagement, and these are multi-stakeholder dialogues or initiatives with NGOs, sometimes with government representatives as well. They can do that too. There are collective direct engagement. These are joint public statements. One example here is the open letters from the CEOs in Minnesota after ICE had killed 2 citizens there. And then there's this individual indirect engagement. These are, for example, companies. There's a company, a watchmaker in Germany that organizes basically democracy workshops within their company, where they just talk about what it means to live in a liberal democracy, what social market economy is, and so on and so forth. So these are different tactics company leaders can employ. What is interesting here, this metrics help us to do this. In general, the research, at least the research I'm aware of, when we talk about the legitimacy of corporate political engagement, well, we talk about this as if this is just one unified block. While our metric shows that there are many different ways how companies can engage. And what I suggest in another paper is that in order to understand the legitimacy of corporate political engagement better, is we should talk not about corporate political engagement on a higher level as a unified block, but we should talk about the tactics these companies apply. Also, this metrics helps us to understand the impact of this engagement better. So rather than talking about, well, corporate political engagement is helpful to protect liberal democracy or is not helpful, has impact or has no impact, we suggest we should talk about the individual tactics, and then we can measure them better. Well, I think that is what I have for the moment. I would have some backup slides, but maybe there's time for discussion as well. So I leave it like it is here. But again, in a nutshell, we think that in order to understand the legitimacy and the impact of corporate political engagement better, we should zoom in or zoom down a little bit on the tactics level on what companies actually do in order to understand the legitimacy of this engagement and the impact of this engagement better. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Marcus, you covered things I wanted to talk about, so I had to just as you were going through your presentation, I had to adapt and adjust the content I was supposed to cover. Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. So it's a great follow-up. What I want to say. It's a project we've been working on. As Francesco said, this is part of the Rebalance project, and it's something we've been working on with Andy, Zina, and ISEF for a while now. I won't go through there, I'll go through there, but I think if I have to add something on your presentation is that distinction between left-wing and right-wing populism. This would potentially add an interesting distinction. So the way populism, the way we understand the variations of populism and how this impacts firms is as follows. Left-wing populism, we think, introduces a focus on redistributive measures and focus on socioeconomic stratification. And what does this do is that it targets firms as representatives of corrupted elites that focus on, that aim to reinforce and maintain a corrupted capitalist system that contributes to rising inequalities. Whereas right-wing populism introduces a more complex and paradoxical challenge in the sense that it combines pro-market measures and incentives such as tax breaks, and at the same time targets the private sector as representatives of corrupted elites. And what's more importantly, and more worryingly, it focuses on environmental, social, and governance commitments as evidence, and uses that as evidence of their detachment from people's real concerns. And it is this particular variation of populism that we focused on this project. So what we did is that we didn't want to investigate only how populism plays out within a single regime, but we also wanted to investigate how populism plays out across regimes. Thus, we focused on autocracies and used Saudi Arabia as a proxy, hybrid political regimes, used Turkey as a proxy, and we used the main body of interviews from the UK, but we supplemented some of them from Europe in order to enhance our analytical focus. So the sample primarily consists of large domestic firms and multinationals and civil society organizations, and we focused on topics that social predominantly focused topics that are highly polarized and are used by populist leaders as indicative examples of how detached the private sector is from people's reality by addressing these topics. So we focused on immigration, gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, and minority inclusion. What we realized by analyzing the different contexts is that issue salience varies. So immigration plays out differently in the UK than in Turkey, than in Saudi Arabia. So in the UK, for instance, there is a prominent anti-immigrant rhetoric as in the UK, especially post-Brexit, but throughout Europe as well. Whereas in Turkey, Erdogan uses that as a means of negotiation in order to strengthen Turkey's position against its European future. So they have an open door refugee policy there, whereas in Saudi Arabia, there are strict immigration measures. Gender equality is used as an example of woke engagement in the UK. There are rollback of gender reforms in Turkey, whereas in Saudi Arabia, there are limited rights, and so on and so forth. So what we saw, as I said, is that there is issue salience varies based on different contexts. So to analyze corporate stances and how firms respond to populism, we used their position, whether this is covert or overt, and their ideological alignment. So in our sample, we found firms that were openly aligned with the populist regimes. We found others that weren't. We used animal metaphors as heuristic labels, mainly because the intention of this project is to speak to practitioners and then to scholars and policymakers. So we use these animal metaphors as heuristic labels because we believe they are quite catchy and they capture the very essence of how corporations respond to populist pressures. Thus, firms that they were openly aligned with populist pressures, we label them as dogs due to the animals' loyal and occasionally loud features. Those who were openly contesting populist challenges, we label them as lions due to their independent and powerful features of that animal. Whereas firms that they implicitly complied with the populist regimes, we label them as sheeps. And lastly, those who covertly contested populist regimes, we label them as foxes due to the cunning nature of this animal. So our initial analysis and understanding is that depending on issue of salience, firms might adopt a given position. But the more we dig into our data, the more we realize that these are not fixed organizational identities. So firms might be dogs in one issue, lions in another, sheep in one issue, foxes in another. And that variation might play out within the same regime. So to give you an example, we observed firms that were sheep when it came to immigration in the UK, but lions when it came to racial diversity or gender equality, mainly because immigration is way more contentious as an issue, as a topic than gender equality and racial diversity are. We observed firms who were lions when it came to gender equality, when it came to gender equality in Turkey, but foxes when it came to immigration, mainly because they wanted to oppose Erdogan and his open refugee policy. And thus we observed various positions being adopted dynamically by firms. Overall, our data points to the fact that the type of positioning a company might take against the populist challenge depends on its values, depends on its political exposure and sectoral characteristics. And then we expanded the analysis a bit across regimes, and we saw that we didn't find any lions in liberal democracies, implying that early levels of populist consolidation don't invite active contestation, whereas we didn't find any lions in Saudi Arabia. Sorry, I said lions. We didn't find any dogs in the UK, whereas we didn't find any lions in Saudi Arabia. So there was absence of dogs in liberal democracies, absence of lions in autocracies, and overall a preference towards hybrid positions and engagement in non-contentious issues than contentious ones, mainly because firms prefer to not openly engage with such topics. So if I were to highlight a couple of policy implication ideas, I would say, and that can be debatable, I understand that, as there are clear normative implication regarding these ideas. But if I were to link these ideas directly with our findings, I would say that what we need to is to reduce structural incentives for firms to adopt open political alignment by strengthening rules-based governance systems, limiting, and that might be quite debatable, discretionary state power, so that we weaken the conditions that promote corporate loyalism and restore firms' autonomy as an independent actor. A couple of examples of how this could play out is by reducing political discretion when it comes to licensing and procurement, by promoting and having in place transparent and rules-based allocations, or by enforcing competition policy and anti-clientelism measures that combat political favoritism. Another one would be to ensure safe and legitimate spaces. And I do understand that that might be debatable as well, whether we want corporate engagement with such issues or not. But I'll say it because I think it's important when it comes to them taking an active role to ensure protection of fundamental human rights and differentiating that point you mentioned, Marcus, between tactics and commitment. So when it comes to them taking a stance, I would say it's important to ensure the conditions that create safe and legitimate spaces for engagement in contested ESG issues. The idea here is to move firms from silence or even neutrality into a more active engagement with such issues without the fear of political backlash. This could be done by institutionalizing multi-stakeholder forums in a way that is way more active than that currently is, or by ensuring collective engagement through industry associations and coalitions to diffuse risk of individual political backlash. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass it on to Elisa.
The topic here is reversing, if we want, the discussions we've had so far in this session. It looks more at how corporations can undermine democracy by influencing electoral vote decisions by citizens, namely their victims, especially when companies misbehave. Okay, so that's the whole topic. So basically it responds to the broader question of the project, how companies can weaken democracies, even in countries that are democratic countries or are at the center of European countries or similarly advanced liberal democracies, so to speak. And the core focus of this research is just focusing on how corporations or firms, when they operate in a given territory, through their activities and namely through their misbehavior, can somehow over time influence decisions of citizens who happen also to be victims of this misconduct in terms of their propensity to vote or attract or populist vote. So these are the key questions, and it's not, these questions are trying to explore the relationship between being exposed as a citizen to organizational wrongdoing and the propensity to abstain from vote or vote for populist or anti-system parties, but also through what channels or through what mechanisms this relationship might hold. We focus on one specific type of misconduct at the corporate level, which is pollution, air pollution more specifically. We take, this is a mixed method, actually NEST mixed method research, so it's focusing on a case study, so the external validity of this study is of course the one that you would see for case studies, but we have tried to have an internal validity by combining both quantitative analysis, as I will tell in a second, and qualitative analysis based on interviews to local citizens. We are talking about a company which is a steel company in a city called Taranto in the southern part of Italy, as highlighted here in the Italian map with the red color. This city is hosting this steel plant since the mid-60s. This steel plant is therefore been built in the 50s and the 60s with those technologies, and it's not an electric steel production, it's a coal-based steel production, so it's very, very polluting. Over the years there have been very little supervision of the pollution, and this has ended up causing an abnormal number of fatalities for especially cancer, different types of cancers, including infant cancers and different types of very rare diseases, and a lot of malformation for newborns. As you see in the pictures above here, there is a picture we took in Taranto saying Ilva killed my mother, and here is a demonstration from people showing statistics about the mortality rates observed in Taranto for related to this pollution, and this pollution impact on health has been documented by multiple researchers, also commissioned by the judiciary. There have been many lawsuits against the company. All ended up being dismissed for some reason or some other, and nobody went to jail actually a single day, despite, I would say, for instance, in first degree, some of these lawsuits have sent to prison the half of the management of the company for 400 years. But then when you get to the third degree, either several things happens. It's Italy after all, and so justice has never been achieved. But we are not talking about this today. We're talking about how this exposure, after people and citizens realize that pollution is harming their health, has influenced their voting decisions. So the first thing and the first challenge, and I will be brief on the technicalities of the methods, and I'm open to questions in the interest of time and the discussion on policy that I think is more important. But basically the first part is, okay, measuring ILVA-related air pollution. And so this is of course not a very easy task. As you saw from the slides, from the first slides, this is a co-author work with 3 other scholars. And of course, their work has been super important to also create and develop and refine the existing indicators for this. So we measure pollution using a Lagrangian particle dispersion model, which is a type of model that is normally used to see whether pollutants move around geographies. And as you see from this graph, basically, this is the plant, where the plant is located. And here is the area with the orange color is the area that has, in the city, has more pollution, is more subject to pollution. We focus, this is an average for the period 2012-2022. We cover, our analysis covers 10 years. And okay, I'm not telling you where we start with 2012, but there are motivations for that. So the key question is whether we exploit these intra-neighborhoods precinct level heterogeneity in exposures to pollution coming from ILVA to see whether this matches with or relates to, actually we make as let's say a mild causality claim, whether this brings citizens that live in the differently exposed precincts, which are unique units, electoral units within Taranto, if they vote controlling for other observable factors less, or they vote more for populist parties. So what we find, and here I'm jumping to the results, we conduct for the quantitative part an econometric analysis using panel regressions, where we look at the influence of exposure to air pollution from ILVA and populist and low turnout and populist vote, controlling for a number of factors and observable characteristics which we know would influence vote. And we do find essentially that ILVA-related pollutions lowers turnout and also increases populist vote. So across several specifications of our model, we do find these consistent results over time. But of course, this is not enough. We have therefore gone to the field. We have interviewed 43 citizens, which we have that are residents and live in the precincts that fit the model most. So precincts that are both highly polluted, where there is lower voter turnout, and where there is more populist vote. Okay, namely, these are two precincts from two neighborhoods. One is the top one here is Città Vecchia, and the other one is Tamburi, which you see here is really very close to the plant. This is one of the most polluting chimneys of the plant, and it's known for emitting a high level of dioxins. So we run the axial coding comes with, the qualitative evidence, it's transcribed. On the qualitative evidence, we do axial coding and as with the usual methodology. So I'm not going to show you and discuss this table, but I'm going to give you the overall picture of the results that we find, that is in a summarizing, in the interest of summarizing the results. And so we start with ILVA-related pollution, and the first interest is to see voter turnout. We do find that it reduces voter turnout, and we try to understand what are the mechanisms for that. And we do explore the mechanisms, as I was saying, through axial coding, which we, from the interviews, but also we have, a secondary robustness exercise based on press evidence, on the evidence from the news, which is, of course, consistent with the story that comes up from the interviews. So first of all, the fact that there is pollution has created a strong disillusionment among the local citizens, specifically because there is a key boundary condition here, which is the fact that these citizens have been abandoned by politics and institutions. That is, the company has continued polluting over many years, And despite judiciary intervention, despite a number of also decrees by the mayor to stop the factory from contaminating and a number of administrative interventions, the company has always continued production, very often backed up by the national government. And people clearly felt that they were abandoned by the very institutions that were tasked to protect them and to protect their health. And so this created two concurrent feelings among the local population. On the one hand, some of them continue to believe in politics. I have to say, Taranto is one of the cities with the highest level of political vote historically. So politics has been always very important, and political ideologies in Taranto have been very important for many, many decades. And so they still believe in politics, but they no longer trust politicians. So there is this response with candidates they don't see fit for the purpose of addressing the environmental problem, or there's one group of people who simply don't trust or distrust both politics and politicians, especially towards the end of the period of observation. So they think politics is simply self-serving, and they therefore withdrew from the ballot, despite the fact that they have been very much in favor of exercising political vote. Think about in the 70s, 90% or more than 90% of the people in Taranto would go and vote. So very high levels, which dropped to 50, 60% in the more recent time. So in parallel, there is also a response that is not just withdrawal from the ballot, but also changing from traditional political parties to anti-system parties. And so another thing I have to say, traditionally, Ilva is a worker city. So for many historical reasons, it has been a city that has voted a lot for the Communist Party and for the left parties, okay? So the first reaction that favored then populist vote or anti-system vote was being disillusioned and started distancing from traditional left parties. Why? Because they felt that traditional left parties prioritized employment, jobs, over health. They were not able to navigate when this was needed, this duality. They didn't offer responses to that. They didn't perceive that they were offering consistent responses on that, and so they felt betrayed. And so because of that, they fall prey of populist alternatives that pops up because there was an opportunity, a window of opportunity that new populist parties saw in this particular vacuum of responses by traditional parties and traditional politics. And so they started to believe in new leaders or new figures who promised to solve the issue very easily. And there was a surge of votes towards anti-system parties. The party in question here is the Movimento 5 Stelle, which is not a right-wing party. It's more like a mixed, ambivalent party. We can talk more about it. But basically, this is the key party that surged in the election and had a big role and a destabilizing role as well, because when these parties will appear and get a lot of votes, and they don't deliver, because clearly populist parties, they are appealing because they have appealing messages, but they are not always able to actually solve the problems or address the problems in a very serious way. In fact, they weren't able to address the problems the way they promised. Then this created further disillusionment. People started also to vote for populist party because they were having trust in given people more than in the party itself. But all this collapsed when these people don't deliver, when these groups don't deliver. And this creates a further, this is, at the basis of anti-system vote, but this additional disappointment can, although we didn't examine this from a quantitative point of view, can also fuel back into abstention. So this is the key illustrative results of the study. Now, what I want to focus now in these last few minutes is the policy-oriented discussion, okay? So I'm not going to go to theory or anything. I think this has been covered by previous presentations. So There is a problem of abstention. We see in Europe, we see many parties in the many countries that used to be like very much more committed to exercise the vote, political vote. I think, and we think that there is, and this is what you also said before in the previous presentation, there's even more dangerous, the volatility and the erratic nature of anti-system vote. Because when it's you go to anti-system vote, you are more vulnerable in the sense that your fate or the fate of a country or a region depend on the leadership and the populist leadership orientation. If you think about Trump, or you never know where these people are going to end up, or what is their agenda becomes very, very uncertain and volatile. And this is where the danger lies, okay? Now, previous research has looked at abstention and populist vote, especially with the relationship. I mean, they have tried to understand the causes of these. And a lot of the literature looks at economic decline or inequality, as well as the peripherality of certain territories over the central regions. And the focus of this work was instead pollution from companies and the institutional and political neglect as this pollution persisted as key elements of political disaffection. And so ultimately, what we see is that there is this personal or collective suffering, whether it is from pollution or unemployment or other causes that lead citizens to go against traditional parties who have betrayed them and be vulnerable, therefore, to populist leaders. And of course, the obvious recommendation in our specific context is to ensure that you minimize instances of corporate wrongdoing, is either avoided or remedied timely. You don't allow such a level of wrongdoing to persist over decades. And so clearly this is the most obvious recommendation. And of course, as a follow-up of this, corporate sustainability due diligence directive type of policies are much needed, because they would fill the void that in this particular case is left by the state, or they would make companies much more responsible. In the discussion on ILVA, which is a national discussion almost every day on the press, I've never heard a politician or a representative of the business sector, let alone the company itself, talk about the business, the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, or the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. They never had a conversation about the need to respect human rights, despite the EU having ruled about it. There are several discussions also at the EU level about ILVA and so on. So clearly, there's this policy would be very much needed, would be the natural type of terrain where you can limit these negative human rights impacts, but also therefore avoid the negative spillover that we have observed on electoral vote, okay, which is even more, as I was saying, even more dangerous for democracies. So
Elisa, just 1 minute.
Yes, this is the last slide. What I wanted to say, just to conclude, is that if you then bring these into the real world that we are facing now, I mean, the same populist parties that rule, I mean, the current problem is that the same populist party, not necessarily the ones that are dominant in Taranto, but for instance, in our case, the populist party who is governing the country, are against the same initiatives, such as the Corporate Social Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. In Italy has been lobbying for very strongly against it. And so clearly that exacerbates that neglect, which in turn reinforces, is likely to reinforce more populist parties. So there is some kind of perverse situations in which where the solution is, what policy to recommend to the EU, okay? Because based on my research, I can say we need more safeguards, we need more regulations, even within the EU, because EU companies aren't respecting human rights, even in countries with a strong rule of law, okay? And so I know what's the policy recommendation. I know what's the recipe for avoiding such a disastrous outcome, but then I know that there is no terrain at the EU level in terms of the political terrain to receive this kind of indications. And so clearly, because populist leaders are against the very political advice that we are giving now. So which puts me, I mean, as an advisor from a scientific point of view in a very difficult situation, because I know what to do, but I know also that the people who are, potentially could make the difference aren't doing that or are not willing to do that. And this further exacerbates the problems that I'm observing in my research and that we are observing and are making our democracies more fragile.